You fool! Warren is dead. Welcome to HorrorBabble. This week, in the lead-up to the April 3rd release of The Damp Man Returns, we're celebrating the works of the great Allison V. Harding. Today, we're off to the House Beyond Midnight, first published in the January 1947 edition of Weird Tales, described as follows: a house that could never have been, and could never be again, seeable only by dead eyes. Our third Harding offering this week will follow on Friday. If you missed Monday's offering, see the video description for a link to the AVH playlist. And without further ado, The House Beyond Midnight by Allison V. Harding. You know how hard it is these days to get rooms, to even get one room. Well, you don't realize exactly how hard it is until you're actually out looking. It didn't help any that I'd lost my coat in the accident, and that Eve's pretty face still bore an ugly mark on the cheekbone from when she'd leaped from the car. When I'd walk into hotels and rooming houses and say, "Name's John Drew, this is my wife. I wonder if you have a room," anything at all, they'd look me up and down and smile in that superior way that hotel clerks and rooming house people have these days. No dice. Even telling them of our most disastrous experience that morning drew little sympathy, much less a place to lay our weary heads. And so we found ourselves 3,000 miles away from home and friends, in a strange East Coast city, with not too much money and evening coming on. For myself, I could have gotten by, but I certainly couldn't picture my lovely young wife spending the night bumming it on a subway station bench, or riding around in a bus with me. The only hostelry clerk that we'd met who seemed halfway human, though I'll admit these days they're a harassed bunch, suggested confidingly to us that our best bet was to head for the Everglades section of town, that by going from house to house we might, just might, find something. So we'd spent the last afternoon hours walking the streets, with the care of a rookie policeman on his first beat. But there was nothing. We sat on a bench in the square and talked over our situation. Although she tried to smile bravely, I could see Eve was fagged out. There was plenty we needed, and all of it seemed awfully far away, sitting on this bench. I had an important business contact to make for my office the next day. In fact, our choice of this section as a trip was a combination of business and honeymoon. That was one of the reasons why we decided not to get involved with the police that morning, a decision, although we didn't know it, that was to shape our next 24 hours in strange and hideous ways. I slapped a mosquito absently on my wrist, hugged Eve tighter. "Well, honey, we certainly can't stay here all night." The traveller's aid people at the station had said kindly, but with no hope, that if we dropped around later that evening they would certainly keep their ears open for us. We got up and began to walk. It was twilight. The avenues were gloomy, and the street lamps, already lighted, did little about it. Some of the places we passed in retracing our steps I half recognized or remembered, because here a woman had shrilled, "Go away, we got no room." And there the janitor had laughed at us, and someplace else a little black dog had barked. Suddenly, Eve's petite figure at my side stiffened. We both stopped, and I followed her pointing arm. Diametrically across the street was a house, old, ramshackle, 4 stories, its brownstone front weather-beaten, and its high stoop sagging. But there, outside a 2nd-story window on a small rusty bar, was a white-painted sign with rude letters, "Room to Let." We fairly ran, and still gasping, I had raised my hand to touch the bell when the door opened before us, as though someone inside had seen our approach. A man stood there with fuzzy, greyish-brown hair that needed cutting, a very white, solemn face. He was dressed nicely. Too nicely for the house, I thought fleetingly, but I remembered my tongue. "The room to let, is it?" He nodded. I noticed then the newspaper under his arm. He glanced at it, and then at us, and there was a mournful widening of his lips as though he were trying to smile. I burbled on about how desperately we were in need of finding a place. It was Eve's nudge that shut me up, for our landlord, if that he was paying little attention. I held out a $20 bill and said, "It's worth this to me." He took it almost absently, and then turned, motioning that we were to follow. The heavy door swung shut behind us, shutting out the city and its noises. The interior of the old house was even more gloomy than its outside. The panelling was wood, yellow with age. There was one ceiling light gleaming weakly in the hall, and by its light we followed the men to the stairs, and up them. We climbed 3 flights. On the 4th floor he stopped and motioned to a door. "We're very full just now." Eve nodded, and murmured something about how nice it was of him. The room wasn't much. It had 2 rude twin cots, a chair, and a table boxed in by faded strips of wallpaper. "My name is Mr. Melkin," our guide introduced himself. We nodded, and I replied, "I'm John Drew, and this is my wife." "Of course," said Melkin. "And now, if you'll excuse me, I must go downstairs to join the others." Alone in our 2x4, the first thing we both did after congratulating ourselves was to sit down on the edge of our beds and take off our shoes. "Better than the park bench, honey," I philosophized, as I noticed my wife's rather critical looks around the room. "I suppose so, Johnny, but for $20. We stretched out and enjoyed the luxury of relaxing for a while. "There are things to be found out," I said. "For instance, what about meals? Certainly we're entitled to them for my one night's rate of payment." My mouth watered at the thought of a well-laid boarding-house table. I left Eve and went down the creaking stairs. On the 2nd floor, there was a large back room taking the width of the building. From it, I heard people sounds. My first feeling upon going in was one of embarrassment at my untidy appearance, for these people were neat, well-dressed in some cases, richly so. But Mr. Melkin seemed in no way ashamed of me. He came over from where he'd been talking to a group of men. It was on the tip of my tongue to ask him about supper when he said, "You're looking surprisingly well, you know." I thanked him. I was about to return the compliment, as convention dictates, but in all honesty I couldn't. Mr. Melkin did not look surprisingly well. He looked surprisingly poor. You don't say those things, of course. Then he said that he wanted to introduce me to some of the others. I said that was Jake, but I knew I looked so terrible. "You see, I lost my coat in an accident early this morning." "Of course," said Mr. Melkin, interrupting me almost impatiently. "You're like him," he said, absently pointing into a corner. I looked. There was a man there I hadn't seen at first, also without a coat but horribly disfigured, his scars looking almost open in the dim light. I looked away. Melkin's voice droned monotonously now, making introductions. I smiled politely. The main thought in my mind was, when do we eat? The people, too, had a sameness that made it hard for me, even if I'd been sincerely trying, to remember their names. I wondered again why such rather well-dressed clientele should be in such a ramshackle, broken-down old house. The times, I supposed. They certainly weren't a very lively bunch. They weren't any 3 I'd like to get to join me in a midnight's poker session, and the women, too, were on the rather subdued, glassy-eyed side. Finally, Melkin had finished, and I saw an opportunity to nudge him and ask him about supper. "Will there be anything to eat?" He almost glared at me, reared his white sepulchral head back, and said firmly, Drew. We don't go in much for jokes around here. Jokes, I thought to myself. That's the brush-off. I guess the joke's on me. $20 a night for that lousy little room, and no food thrown in. I was mad, so I didn't push the point. I'd take Eve out, and we'd go to a restaurant somewhere. I still had a few dollars left. Somebody else said, "You're looking surprisingly well." Corny compliments these people handed out. I went up the stairs to find Eve. She was pacing the floor nervously. "Guess we'll have to go out to get some food, honey." "Listen, Johnny, the funniest thing happened while you were downstairs." The words catapulted out of her. I could see Eve was upset. 2 women came in. At least I looked up suddenly and found them standing inside the door. All dressed up, Johnny, and such stern grey faces. One of them said, "This is Mrs. Drew," and I nodded, and the other said, "You're looking surprisingly well." Johnny, there was something sort of scary about them. They seemed to know who I was, and they told me who they were, and they just stood there and looked. It was creepy the way they looked at me. I put my arms around Eve. She was an imaginative little thing anyway. "Just trying to be neighborly," I offered. But that wasn't all. When they turned around to go, one of them... Eve made a sick face. "Really, Johnny, one of them had a hole in the back of her head you could put your fist into." I smiled in superior male fashion. "Probably the way the shadows fell, honey." No, I tell you I saw it. It was like someone had dug out the whole back of her head." "Oh, well," I laughed. "Some injury or something. Forget it. Look, we'll go out somewhere and get a bite to eat." She said that was even worth putting her shoes on again for. We traipsed down the stairs. In the front hall we met Melkin. "Just stepping out to get something to eat," I explained. "We'll be back in a moment." He looked at me steadily, his pallid face expressionless. Finally, he spoke. "Surely you're joking." I shook my head. What kind of double talk was this? I explained again painstakingly and added, as though I needed further justification for our trip, "I want to pick up an evening paper, too." He stood there staring at me appraisingly. "Doubtless you have reasons, Mr. Drew, for your frivolity, but I can only say that this house is now closed. As for an evening paper, I believe we have one." He stepped to a side boy and offered me the paper I'd seen under his arm earlier. I was for making an argument out of it, but Eve tugged at me and pulled me up the stairs. "Darling, it's better than spending the night out on that park bench. What of it if he's a little eccentric? Certainly he's no more of a dragon than some of the other hotel people we've met." I sighed. I didn't like backing down to old Cheeseface, but I knew Eve's words were of wisdom, and I went with her back up to our room. Anyway, it was nice to take our shoes off again. My wife curled up at the window, and after looking out into the dim street for a moment over her shoulder, I sat down on one of the cots with the evening paper. Eve chattered away as she does, and I answered monosyllabically, all the time absorbing the details of the box score on the day's ball game. "Valley Street. This is Valley Street and Everglades Avenue, Johnny. I could swear we passed by here before. Certainly there was no sign then for a room to let. I wonder who left." Said I, reading about a great catch Hoskins had made in centre field for the Blue Sox. "Fact, I don't even remember this old house." Eve was silent for a moment, and I got finished with the story of the ball game. My eyes drifted downward idly over the page. They stopped. Something slugged me in the stomach. My jaw fell open. The heading said, "2 die in auto crash. August 9. Mr. and Mrs. John Drew of Briarville, California, died today in Westville River when their car skidded off Gormley Highway," police reported. The type before my eyes swam a bit. Eve said, "What is it, dear?" and patted over to my side. I had enough presence of mind to start to flip the paper shut, But she was too quick for me. She read and sank down beside me. "Johnny," she said. "Johnny." I took her hand. I wanted to say all sorts of things about the ghastly mistake, about how we'd have to get down to police headquarters in a hurry the next morning and explain everything. And Eve, don't look so white. But strangely nothing came out. Then the tapping came at the door, and I sprang to my feet like an overwound spring. It was Melkin. He stood in the doorway regarding me with those sober, colourless eyes, and said, "Drew, you're new here, and there are one or two things I have to explain to you about this place. You see, Drew, it's not an ordinary house." As our host advanced into the room towards us, the garish light of the ceiling fixture accentuated the pallor of the man, gave it an almost blue quality that was unearthly. I decided to seize the opportunity to speak before Melkin could. "See here," I said with what I meant to be a disarming smile. "I certainly respect the rules of this boarding house, but something has come up that requires our attention immediately. Mr. Melkin, I am sorry, but we'll have to go out just for a few minutes." The gathering storm of displeasure showed on my host's face, and I hurried on. Certainly, under the circumstances, my request was reasonable. "You see, there's been a rather grisly mistake that needs correcting." I flipped the paper over, pointing to the article about our accident and demise. I thought that this would surely cinch my argument. But instead of showing any interest, Melkin glanced casually at the item and then looked once again at me, his dark, expressionless eyes unblinking. Most of the anger had left his face, and there was instead a look of almost scorn. I pushed on, almost embarrassed by the sound of my own voice in that small, echoing chamber. I tried the smile again. "It says John Drew and wife are dead, and being John Drew, I gave Eve's wrist an affectionate pinch, and wife, I feel this has got to be corrected at police headquarters. We haven't any friends in this section of the country, but if the word got back to the coast, it would be kind of a mean trick." Melkin gazed at me as though my words had had no meaning. I stood up, took Eve's hand in one of mine, and stepped towards the door. I'm big enough to be able to see over other people's heads at parades, and I didn't anticipate having any trouble with our host, and knew I looked rather menacing. However, Melkin merely grimaced a bit and admonished, "You can't hurt a dead man, you know. I am sorry you can't go out." I gulped and stopped short. "Now wait a minute. You can't go out." I reached for the paper again and thumped the item. "I tell you this has to be corrected. A thing like that can make a lot of trouble." The boarding house proprietor's lips curled almost into a sneer. Then he sighed. "So many of you act this way," he said almost to himself, "but in time you'll get used to it. They all do." His lips came back from yellowed teeth in what was supposed to be a smile. He turned and headed for the door, and I was too amazed to do anything, until finally I shouted, "Melkin, my wife and I are leaving this place. If you don't want us to come back, well, that's too bad, but we must speak to the police and have this business corrected." He turned at the door, looked back at us. "You can't go out. Some of the others take time to get used to this idea, but one and all we have to reconcile ourselves to it. After all, Mr. Drew, you two are dead, you know." He left, shutting the door behind him. Eve was the colour of the departed Melkin when I turned to look at her. I sat her on the bed and gripped her shaking hands, although mine were none too steady. "Honey," I said, "the guy's loco. We'll get out of here." "Johnny, he's so terribly white. You know, when I first saw him downstairs I thought that. White like a dead person. And those women who came in to see me." She hid her head in her hands, and her square little shoulders shook. "Don't be silly," I blustered, spilling words of reassurance out as fast as I could. but all the time thinking, what is this? Those people I'd blundered into downstairs. People? Creatures, strange, and all with that peculiar pallor. I comforted Eve for a moment more, and then I sprang to the door. Perhaps I expected it to be locked. It was not. It flew open. I leaped out into the hall. The corridor to the stairs was dim, and along its sides were lounging a score or more of figures. I took a step towards the stairs, and the figures, men they were, if you could call them that, tensed. Obviously, I was their business. I felt a sickness in my stomach. Even in the dim light, I could see that they were monstrous, misshapen, and disfigured in one way or another. Here was a man, or what had once been one, with a half-crushed skull, someone else with a twisted back, a third with no leg, and so on. As I stood uncertainly, one of the creatures started towards me. I stepped hurriedly back inside our room and threw the bolt. I dreaded that Eve would discover what I had seen, that we were no longer free to leave the house, but were guarded by an odd assortment of inhumans. Somehow, I now knew we had stumbled on some fantastic sort of insane asylum. I turned away from the door and tried to smile for Eve. It was a poor attempt. I knew it. She knew it, but her smiling back bravely at me helped. It was a courageous, pathetic little gesture on her part, and my heart thumped as I thought of her exquisite young beauty, and outside those profane, godless travesties of humanity. I sat by her side and said softly, "Don't worry, honey. I'll think of something." She looked as if she were going to cry. "What sort of place is this, Johnny?" "Not the kind of joint I'd pick for you ordinarily, my sweet," I tried to joke. "Is it some sort of private insane asylum or something?" So she'd thought of it too. I don't know. And why does everyone look so strange? That whiteness. The thought had persisted in my mind too. "Not enough sunlight and vitamins," I quipped. Whatever else we might have said was interrupted. A voice came from outside. It was Melkin. "Drew," he called. "Yes?" I answered. "You can see by now that it would be quite wrong for you to attempt to leave this house." I said nothing. "I think in time you'll understand that all this is for your own good. You see, we of the older ones know that sudden death has its shocking qualities, that after one has crossed into the beyond, one still continues to try to live, psychically at least, in the dimensions and traditions of the living. You'll get used to being dead, Drew, you and your wife, and then you will be just like any of us. I wonder if you would open the aperture of this door a minute." I looked, and discovered the peep slide that one finds on many apartment front doors. I peered through, and saw with distaste the pallid face and shoulders of Melkin. "I am placing outside your room," he went on as soon as he saw my eye at the aperture, "a trusted helper of mine, to keep you from doing anything which, shall we say, you might regret." At that he gestured, and from one side came a heavy step. Suddenly, into my view loomed up a huge monster of a man. It was, I saw, surely one of the figures I'd seen lounging along the hall earlier. A monster of a man with a brutal face, and one side of his head bashed in. It was an incredible, revolting sight, highlighted by the absurdity of the gay, red-flowered tie he wore around his bull neck. "This is Jacob," said Melkin. "He's going to stay outside your door, and I would suggest you and Mrs. Drew get used to the idea of being in the beyond. You will pardon, I'm sure, Drew, our little house joke, but you see, one is dead such a long time, that the sooner one becomes accustomed to it, the better." The monstrous Jacob grimaced at this appreciatively, and I slammed the 1-inch peep shut. I put my fingers to my lips, and Eve and I sat together on the bed, silently listening to the mute, unintelligible sounds of the house grow small and finally cease, until there was nothing but the soft rustle of the wind outside the window. My clock showed 2:30. It was then that I started a minute examination of the room in stocking feet. There was nothing of interest, no furniture even heavy enough to act as a formidable weapon. Finally, I turned to the window and eased it up inch by inch. I looked out. There was a narrow ledge running the width of the house. The dingy, poorly lit street below was, of course, completely empty at this hour. Eve was off the bed and after me as she sensed what was in my mind. Her tiny feet, likewise shoeless to keep from making a sound, pattered toward me. "No, Johnny," she clung to me. "We can't go out that way. I'm going to take a look in the rooms on either side of us." She pleaded with me. "Nothing to it, Eve," I reassured. "Now just sit tight, and I'll be right back." She pulled at my arm desperately as though she could hold me back by main force, but finally I convinced her, and with a kiss I edged carefully out the window. If I were seen from the street and a call put into the police, so much the better. But I knew the chances of anyone passing by in this section of the city, and at this hour, were infinitesimal. The window to the right of ours was tightly locked, but with my eyes growing accustomed to the gloom, I could see that it opened into nothing more productive than a utility closet. There were brooms and odds and ends and shelves piled high with ill-arranged boxes and bric-a-brac. Retracing my steps gingerly, I went in the other direction, and on the left was rewarded by an open window. I eased myself through, and found I was in a room very similar to ours, but with 2 doors. One, I figured, opened onto the stairs. The other was smaller, I found on closer examination, not reaching quite to the floor. I opened it cautiously, and found a small shaft before me disappearing into blackness. A stout rope hung in the center, and suddenly it came to me that these old houses were often equipped with rope-pulley dumbwaiters to serve the different floors. As I was about to shut the dumbwaiter door, voices came to me from some room adjacent to the shaft in the evil old house. Melkin's tones were unmistakable. He was talking with several other people, and I could tell that there was excitement between them, and then my ears caught my own name. I leaned way over the coping of the door, and the voices came clearer. "You fool," said one voice which carried with its sepulchral tones a note of authority. "Their reported death was one of those imbecile mistakes that the authorities make." "But," whined Melkin defensively, "I'd seen the item in the paper, and naturally I thought—" "You thought?" went on the other voice, and the strains had an oddly metallic, reverberating character. "You know now, of course, what we must do, and immediately." A third voice joined in agreeing. "Yes," said Melkin. "People in this house beyond life must obviously be dead. If they are not, well, I shall attend to it." "Do," snapped the authoritative voice. "At once," replied Melkin, cowed. I shut the door as quickly as I could and hurried toward the window. I still couldn't figure quite what the pitch was here, but that we were dealing with a deadly bunch of characters who now intended to murder us, I did not doubt. I gained our window and beckoned to Eve just as Melkin's rap came at the door. I hurried her over the ledge and pushed her into the next room. Melkin called again, and the rapping became louder. Then I heard his quick order to someone, probably Jacob, and as I slithered sideways along the ledge, one arm around Eve's waist, I heard the sudden splintering crash of wood panel, and I pictured those pallid, loathsome faces and forms hurtling into the room we just left. I hurried my wife into the next chamber, got in after her, shut and locked the window, and then bolted the door. But I knew, my mind working now with the rapidity of desperation, that it would only be a matter of moments before these creatures of the devil were upon us again. Already I heard steps outside in the corridor, heavy, lumbering steps. Jacob, of course, and others. A few steps more, and they would be splintering this door. I whirled suddenly, opened the dumbwaiter shaft and jiggled the rope. It was a heavy rope, and there was a weight at the end. Like a madman, I heaved on the pulley, and groaning and creaking, finally the little two-shelved lift came up out of the darkness and drew level with us. There was no time for talk now. I swept Eve's soft round figure into my arms and stowed her into the dumbwaiter. I loved her more then than I think I ever had. No hysterics, no tears, just her white-strained face turned toward mine. She said, grasping quickly what was going on, "Please come with me, Johnny, or let me stay with you." I shook my head, and that was that. With a prayer for her safety, I began to lower the waiter and Eve feverishly. This would at least throw them off for a while. And then, even before the thundering knocks came at the door of the room, I saw Melkin's diabolically evil face leering at me from the window. While slow-witted Jacob had lumbered down the corridor, searching aimlessly, Melkin had anticipated my moves and come along the ledge in pursuit. Like a football player, I dove at the window, carrying the sash and glass with me, counting on catching myself against the bottom with my thighs. My arms were outstretched in frenzied action. He must not surmise which way Eve's trail led. I felt my hands hit the solidity of his knees, and then he pitched out from the ledge. It was so easy, and I felt a little sick. I didn't look down, but there was the unmistakable sound of a human body landing 4 floors below, on the cobblestones. There was no time to be weak-kneed now, though. The door of the room was being attacked from the outside, and I heard Jacob's slobbering curses. Another idea came to me, and again I opened the shaft. I crawled in myself this time, gripping the rope with one hand and letting the dumbwaiter door shut behind me. Then, hand over hand, I lowered myself into that black pit, unmindful of the rope splinters digging into my fingers. Above, and always farther away as I let myself down, came the sound of those creatures pouring into the room Eve and I had left. Finally, my feet thumped against wood, and Eve's hushed voice came. "Johnny? Darling," I said, "where are we?" "I think it's some sort of sub-basement," she whispered. I crawled between the top of the dumbwaiter and the opening of the shaft. It was a tight squeeze for a big man, and I had no buttons left on my vest when I finally stood beside her in the darkness. "Now let's be getting out of here." We explored and bumped our way in the darkness, and from what we ran into, I decided there were boxes and furnace fixtures and what not. I tripped over one such something, and then found to my joy that it was a heavy poker. I claimed it, and we went on. "At least, honey," I said, "we won't be bothered with that Melkin any more. I took care of him." Eve didn't press me for details, but the thought of what I'd done to our murderous, sinister host no longer nauseated me. Luckily, we were standing behind some packing cases when the cellar door up ahead was thrown open abruptly. I pulled Eve down as light streaked the sub-basement. I couldn't see, but we were not yet out of the woods. People were coming. One of them was Jacob. Although there was no talk among them now, I could tell by the ponderous, lumbering footsteps. They had flashlights, and the wavering beams passed a few feet from where we crouched. My heart thumped and turned over in my throat as someone leaned against our packing case. The others went on, and I could see Jacob and 2 or 3 more. Then, as though the sound of our breathing had drawn him, the man leaning against our packing case turned slowly, inexorably before us. I rose up and hit him with the poker with all my strength, even before he turned fully toward us, even before I saw who it was. For had I seen, I never could have struck that mighty blow. It was Melkin. How shall I say it? Disfigured as a man is who falls 4 flights onto cobblestone, but Melkin, alive as he had been before. Alive, did I say? His words to me earlier that fateful night came back now. You can't hurt a dead man. The force of my blow at his head shattered the bone and sent him reeling backward, but the injury was as nothing to him. "Run, Eve!" I screamed. "Run for the door!" She did my bidding, and I charged after Melkin, who leered at me, his soulless, empty eyes looking like Satan himself in that battered head. It was Eve's scream that brought me whirling about. She had run fully into the huge Jacob, who stood half a body above her, as he raised his massive arms around her, and I could see over her head that grotesquely humorous red-flowered tie of his. I charged toward my wife and the monster who sought to crush the life out of her body. Other limping, stumbling creatures were behind me, thumping along in pursuit, but my eyes were fixed only on Jacob and Eve. I hit him with the crowbar, and he let go of Eve to come at me, his hands spread apart. I sidestepped his elephant charge and shoved Eve toward the basement door that beckoned to us. She ran, and I followed, but at the steps Jacob, with surprising speed, caught us. He took the poker from my hands as though it were a slim reed of wood. One thick forearm snaked around Eve's legs, and she, who had refused to dash up the steps to safety until I was beside her, fell gasping to the stairs. I dove at Jacob, and knew immediately that my strength, considerable though it was, would be no match for his. Others, led by Melkin, were coming up. I knew I had a few more seconds, and then we would be prisoners again, and for good, in that evil house of monstrous horrors. I let myself go completely slack, and my assailant, taken unawares, relaxed his efforts against me. Eve, poor dear, doubtless thinking that I had been overcome, redoubled her own efforts, and Jacob turned his attentions to her. It was then that I sprang from out of my relaxed position. I caught Jacob off his balance with my shoulder, and at the same time swept Eve clear with one arm. He clawed at me desperately, and I rammed my fingers into his bull-like neck. In the melee, that gaudy red-flowered tie ripped off in my grasp, but Jacob, thank God, lost his balance and stumbled backward down the stairs, knocking off those led by Melkin like so many tenpins. In an instant more, Eve and I had scampered on up the stairs and somehow found ourselves outside in the night. We stumbled and staggered through dark, deserted, twisting streets. I drove Eve to frantic haste because behind, for a while I could hear the clumping, sinister sounds of those creatures in pursuit. After a while, we reached a brighter section of the city, and Eve fell against me. "I can't go any further," she gasped. I supported her the rest of the way to the nearest police station. We stopped outside to tidy up a bit, and looking into each other's face, we both realized at the same time that our preposterous story would never be believed. We decided to say nothing about our recent experience, but only to mention and set right the report of our death in the automobile accident. I made the overtures to the usual blasé desk sergeant. He seemed considerably bored, but allowed us how those mistakes sometimes happen, and after all, when a car skids into the river and is raised from under water with both doors sprung open and suitcases found, it's presumed that the parties have drowned and will, as he said in jolly fashion, turn up later somewhere, floating in the river. Sergeant Truckett, for so his name proved to be, was, though, interested in the tie that peeked out of my right-hand pocket. It was Jacob's, torn off him in the melee, and I had stuffed it there absently. "Yours?" said the sergeant. I evaded a direct answer, and he went on. "Funny, you know. There's only one guy around here who wore ties like that. Was quite a character, he was. Loved those loud, red-flowered ties. Just like that one, mister. Would have thought it was one of his." The good sergeant laughed. "Who was this?" "Jacob, his name was. He was a wrestler in these parts. Great, big fellow. died, about a year ago in an accident. He and his manager. Eve put the question that flashed into my mind, too. Was his manager's name Melkin? The sergeant nodded. Guess you know about him, eh? They say wrestling's crooked. Maybe so, but they put on some great shows. I remember once this Jacob. We went out into the street, Eve and I, my arm around her waist, and we walked. Dawn was streaking the sky above the city, and without a word to each other but by apparent mutual consent, we turned our steps in the direction of that sinister 4-story house. We wended our way down Everglades Avenue, 6 blocks, 5 blocks, then 3, 2, and we were suddenly there across the street from where we'd spent the most harrowing night of our lives. I think, looking back now, that I wasn't surprised, and I saw that Eve was not. We have not discussed it since, naturally. Of course, you have guessed it. There was no 4-story, rambling house on the corner in the morning light. There was nothing, no sign of a house, just an open lot with its incidental collection of rubbish. I have the clipping from the paper. You don't often see the notice of your own death. The gaudy, red-flowered tie? No, I didn't keep that, for it belongs to Jacob, wherever he may be. If you enjoyed listening today, be sure to subscribe to the channel by hitting the red subscribe button below. After doing so, click the bell icon next to the subscribe button to receive new content notifications. If you'd like to support our work and receive exclusive perks, consider becoming a channel member by clicking the join button below. To support us in other ways, see the video description for links to our Bandcamp and Patreon pages, our merch store over at Teespring, and further information relating to our releases on Audible, iTunes, and Spotify. And until next time,